What is the true value of a single moment? For Alexander Sterling, a man who could buy anything but happiness, it was a question he'd long forgotten how to answer. In the heart of New York City, surrounded by wealth and power, he was about to witness an act so pure, so unexpected, it would shatter his gilded cage. This isn't just a story about a billionaire and a waitress. It's the story of a father who couldn't see, a son who couldn't speak, and a woman who had nothing to give but the one thing they both desperately needed: kindness. What happens when an act of simple human dignity collides with a world of unimaginable wealth and unspoken pain? The answer will not only change a life, it will redefine it. The Oak Room at the Sterling Plaza was not merely a restaurant, it was a cathedral of wealth, a silent testament to the power of its namesake, Alexander Sterling. The air itself seemed expensive, thick with the scent of aged leather, truffle oil, and the hushed reverence of New York's elite. Sunlight, filtered through towering arched windows, landed in soft golden pools on the crisp white tablecloths, making the polished silver cutlery gleam like treasure. Seated at the most secluded table, Alexander Sterling looked less like he was dining and more like he was holding a hostile board meeting with his lunch. At 52, he was a man carved from granite and ambition. His hair was the color of steel, his jaw was a sharp line of authority, and his eyes, a startlingly cold blue, missed nothing and approved of very little. His custom-made Tom Ford suit was a suit of armor, shielding him from a world he owned but no longer felt a part of. Across from him sat his son, Daniel. At 16, Daniel was trapped in a body that had betrayed him. Cerebral palsy had been the uninvited guest at his birth, a cruel thief that stole his motor control, twisted his limbs, and shackled his speech. Yet behind his eyes, the same startling blue as his father's, burned a fierce, frustrated intelligence. He understood everything. He saw the pitying glances, felt the awkward silences, and most of all, he felt the chasm of distance from the man sitting opposite him. The man who was his father, but felt more like a warden. The waiter, a man with a professionally vacant smile, had placed Daniel's meal, a carefully prepared, soft-cooked risotto, in front of him. A specially designed spoon with a thick, weighted handle lay beside it. For Daniel, lifting that spoon was like lifting a boulder. His left hand, curled tightly into a fist, lay useless in his lap. His right hand trembled, making a valiant, spastic journey towards the utensil. Alexander watched, his jaw tightening with each tremor. He didn't see a son struggling. He saw a problem without a solution, a public display of imperfection. He averted his gaze, pulling out his phone. Stocks, emails, market analyses, a comfortable world of numbers and logic that had no room for the messy, unpredictable reality of his son. He typed a curt email, the tapping of his fingers on the glass, a stark, impatient rhythm against the restaurant's quiet symphony. Daniel finally managed to grip the spoon. The effort sent a tremor through his entire arm. He scooped a small amount of risotto, his brow furrowed in concentration. The journey from the plate to his mouth was a treacherous one. His muscles fought him, jerking his arm. A few grains of rice fell onto the pristine tablecloth. His father didn't look up. He tried again. This time the spoon tilted precariously, spilling most of its contents back onto the plate with a soft slop. A guttural sound of pure frustration escaped Daniel's lips. It was a raw, wounded noise that cut through the polite hum of the restaurant. A few heads turned. Alexander's face flushed with a familiar, toxic mix of anger and embarrassment. "Daniel, control yourself," he said, his voice low and sharp, not lifting his eyes from the phone. The words were like stones, cold and hard. Tears of helpless rage welled in Daniel's eyes. He hated this. He hated the fancy restaurant, the pitying looks, and the cold wall of his father's indifference. He wanted to scream that he was trying, that every second of his life was a battle. But the words wouldn't form, strangled by the same condition that held his body captive. He slammed his trembling fist onto the table, rattling the fine china. It was in that moment of raw, desperate tension that Kaylee Johnson approached their table. Kaylee had been a waitress at the Oak Room for 6 months, and she still felt like an imposter. She moved through the opulent space with a practiced grace, but her mind was usually miles away, calculating the tuition payment for her nursing program at Columbia, or worrying about the rent on the small Bronx apartment she shared with her younger brother, Leo. She was 24, with kind, weary eyes that had seen more hardship than most people in this room could ever imagine. She wore her uniform with pride, but beneath it, her muscles ached from the double shifts she pulled to make ends meet. She had noticed the Sterling table when they came in. Everyone did. It was like royalty visiting. But she hadn't seen the billionaire and his heir. She'd seen a tense, silent man and a boy who looked desperately sad. She saw the spilled risotto. She saw the boy's trembling fist and the tears glistening in his eyes. More importantly, she saw the father, whose attention was buried in a glowing screen, utterly oblivious, or perhaps unwilling, to see his own son's pain. Something inside her, the nascent nurse, the sister, the human being, snapped. Her manager, Mr. Abernathy, a weasel of a man who policed the floor with an iron fist, had a strict rule. Do not engage with guests beyond the scope of service, especially not the VIPs. Engaging with the Sterlings was a cardinal sin. It was inviting trouble. Kaylee didn't care. She walked over, her steps quiet but deliberate. She didn't approach the father. She went directly to Daniel's side, kneeling down so she was at his eye level. This simple act was a profound shift in the room's dynamic. She wasn't a servant looking down. She was an equal, looking across. "Hi," she said softly, her voice a warm contrast to the room's cool atmosphere. "My name is Kaylee. That risotto looks amazing, but it looks like it's putting up a bit of a fight." Daniel stared at her, his tear-filled eyes wide with surprise. No one ever spoke to him like this, directly and without a trace of pity. They spoke at him, or about him, to his father. Alexander Sterling finally looked up from his phone, his blue eyes narrowing with immediate suspicion. Who was this woman? What did she want? Was this some kind of stunt to get a bigger tip? His world was transactional. Kindness was a currency, and he always looked for the price tag. Kaylee ignored him. Her focus was entirely on Daniel. "You know," she continued, her smile genuine, "sometimes you just need a little backup. Would it be okay if I offered some?" She didn't reach for the spoon. She waited. She was asking for permission, acknowledging his agency, something very few people ever did. Daniel hesitated, his gaze flickering from her warm face to his father's cold, scrutinizing stare. He saw the silent command in his father's eyes. Dismiss her. But then he looked back at Kaylee. He saw no pity in her eyes, only a calm, steady understanding. With a slight, almost imperceptible nod, he gave his consent. Abernathy was now watching from across the room, his face turning a blotchy red. He started to move towards the table, ready to intervene, but a subtle, almost invisible hand gesture from Alexander's security detail. A stoic man named Frank, standing by the entrance, stopped him in his tracks. Alexander, for all his annoyance, was now intrigued. He wanted to see how this played out. Kaylee picked up a clean napkin and gently wiped the stray rice from around Daniel's mouth. Then she took the heavy spoon. "All right, risotto," she whispered conspiratorially to the plate. "Prepare to be defeated." Daniel let out a small choke sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. Kaylee scooped a small, manageable portion. She didn't lift it to his mouth immediately. She held it steady. "Ready?" she asked. He nodded again. She brought the spoon to his lips, her hand unbelievably steady, her movements slow and patient. Daniel met the spoon, and for the first time that day, he ate a successful, clean bite of his meal. She didn't rush. They fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm, a gentle scoop, a soft question, a patient pause. It wasn't the mechanical act of feeding someone. It was a shared experience, a quiet dance of trust. She spoke to him between bites, not about his disability or the difficulty, but about normal things. "I'm in nursing school," she said, "up at Columbia. It's tough, but I love it. My little brother, Leo, he wants to be a graphic designer. He draws all over our apartment walls. Drives me crazy, but he's brilliant." She was giving him a piece of her life, treating him not as a patient, but as a person worthy of conversation. Daniel listened, his eyes locked on hers. He couldn't answer with words, but his expression softened. The rigid tension in his shoulders eased. He wasn't just being fed, he was being seen. Alexander Sterling watched the entire exchange in stunned silence. He had hired the best nurses, the most expensive therapists, the most renowned specialists from around the globe. They all came with impeccable credentials and a detached clinical professionalism. They managed Daniel's condition. They never reached his son. This waitress, in her simple black uniform, had broken through a wall in 5 minutes that he hadn't been able to breach in 16 years. He wasn't watching a waitress serve a customer. He was watching a woman connect with his son in a language of compassion he didn't know existed. The armor of his cynicism began to crack, and for the first time in a long, long time, Alexander Sterling felt something other than anger or control. He felt a profound, unsettling sense of awe and of shame. When the plate was empty, Kaylee gently wiped Daniel's mouth one last time. "There," she said with a triumphant smile. "We showed that Rosado who's boss." Daniel's own lips curved into a small, weak but genuine smile. It was a rare sight, a glimmer of sunlight in a perpetually overcast sky. Alexander felt a jolt, as if seeing it for the first time. Kaylee stood up, her professionalism returning. "Is there anything else I can get for you, sir?" she asked, finally addressing Alexander, her tone polite but not subservient. Alexander was still processing. He cleared his throat, his composure reasserting itself like a reflex. "Just the check," he said, his voice gruff. As Kaylee walked away, Daniel's gaze followed her, a look of profound disappointment on his face. The brief warm connection was over. The cold silence returned to the table, but now it felt heavier, more pronounced. When Kaylee returned with the billfold, Alexander didn't even look at it. He took out a thick black money clip, from which he extracted 10 crisp $100 bills. He folded them and held them out to her. $1,000, he stated, not asked. "For your trouble." It was a test. It was a transaction. In Alexander's world, every service had a price. Every problem could be solved with a sufficient application of capital. He had just witnessed an act of kindness, and his immediate instinct was to commodify it, to file it away as paid for. Kaylee looked at the money in his hand, and then at his cold, expectant face. $1,000. That was her rent. It was 2 months' worth of groceries. It was a significant portion of her next tuition payment. It was a lifeline. Her every instinct screamed to take it. Pride didn't pay the bills. She glanced at Daniel. He was watching the exchange, his newfound smile gone, replaced by a look of hurt. He understood exactly what his father was doing, turning her beautiful human gesture into a cheap transaction. He was cheapening her, and in doing so, cheapening the moment they had shared. Kaylee's spine straightened. She looked Alexander Sterling directly in the eye, her own gaze unwavering. "No, thank you, sir," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Alexander blinked, genuinely taken aback. He wasn't used to people turning down his money. "I insist," he said, pushing the bills slightly forward. "You were helpful." "I was just doing my job," she replied, a subtle emphasis on the word job, though they both knew what she had done went far beyond any job description. "And my job doesn't include taking payment for helping one person show another person a little dignity." The word hung in the air between them. Dignity. It was an indictment, a quiet, powerful accusation that struck Alexander harder than any shouted insult. "Please, just take it," he said, his voice strained. This refusal was a complication, a variable he couldn't control, and it irritated him. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Sterling, but I can't," Kaylee said. She gave a small, polite nod. "Have a good day." She turned and walked away, leaving Alexander holding the money, his hands suspended in midair. He felt a fool. He slowly retracted his hand, the crisp bills feeling like burning coals in his palm. He had offered a fortune and been rejected for a principle. He looked at his son. Daniel was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Not anger, not frustration, but something that looked unnervingly like judgment. The rejection gnawed at Alexander for the rest of the day. Who was this woman? This waitress who possessed a quiet strength and moral clarity that made his billions feel cheap and hollow? He couldn't shake the image of her kneeling by his son's side. That evening, back in the sterile silence of his penthouse overlooking Central Park, He made a call, not to a business associate, but to Mr. Harrison, his head of security and personal fixer, a man who operated in the shadows with quiet efficiency. "Harrison," Alexander said, his voice clipped. "There was a waitress at the Oak Room today. Her name is Kaylee Johnson. I want to know everything about her. Everything." He didn't know why he was doing it. Curiosity, annoyance, or was it something else? A nascent, unfamiliar desire to understand the kind of person who could give his son a smile and turn down $1,000 without a second thought. He needed to understand the value of something that couldn't be bought. The fallout from Kaylee's act of compassion was swift and brutal. Mr. Abernathy had been simmering with rage ever since Frank, the security guard, had silently waved him off. To him, Kaylee hadn't been kind. She had been insubordinate. She had broken protocol, overstepped her station, and worst of all, she had drawn the personal attention of the most powerful man in their universe, Alexander Sterling. Abernathy saw this not as a credit to her character, but as a threat to his own carefully managed authority. The next morning, as Kaylee was clocking in for her shift, Abernathy called her into his small, windowless office. The air was stale with the smell of old coffee and thwarted ambition. "Johnson, close the door," he said without looking up from the paperwork on his desk. Kaylee's stomach tightened. She knew this tone. She closed the door, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud. Abernathy finally looked up, his small eyes gleaming with a petty, malicious pleasure. "We have a certain standard of conduct at the Oak Room, Johnson. A protocol. It's what separates us from a common diner. You are aware of this protocol, are you not?" "Yes, Mr. Abernathy." "And you are aware of the rule regarding fraternization with our clientele, particularly our high-profile guests?" "I was just trying to help," Kaylee said, her voice steady. "The boy was in distress." "The boy," Abernathy sneered, "was Daniel Sterling, and his father is Alexander Sterling. They do not require the help of a waitress. They have staff for that. What you did was unprofessional. It was presumptuous. You made the guest, and by extension, the entire establishment, look incompetent." "But Mr. Sterling didn't seem to have a problem with it," Kaylee countered, thinking of his offer of money. This was the wrong thing to say. Abernathy's face darkened. "You think because you got the attention of a billionaire that the rules no longer apply to you? You think you're special?" He stood up, leaning his knuckles on the desk. "Let me tell you what you are, Johnson. You're a liability. You're a rogue element in a finely tuned machine. And I am the mechanic who removes faulty parts." Kaylee's heart sank. "Mr. Abernathy, I need this job." "You should have thought of that yesterday," he said coldly. "Your services are no longer required. Collect your final paycheck from HR. Your personal effects will be mailed to you." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, already picking up his pen, her entire existence reduced to a completed, unpleasant task. Kaylee stood there for a moment, stunned, fired. She had been fired for an act of kindness. The injustice of it was a physical blow. The $1,000 she had refused now seemed like a monument to her own foolish pride. How was she going to pay her tuition? How would she cover the rent? Leo's art supplies? A wave of panic washed over her. She walked out of the office in a daze, past her former colleagues who averted their eyes, already distancing themselves from the newly exiled. She didn't beg or plead. Her pride, the same pride that had refused Alexander's money, wouldn't let her give Abernathy the satisfaction. She walked out of the opulent lobby of the Sterling Plaza and into the harsh light of the city, unemployed and terrified. Meanwhile, in his own skyscraper across town, Alexander Sterling was reading the file Mr. Harrison had personally delivered. It was thin but concise. Kaylee Johnson, 24. Orphaned at 16, parents killed in a car accident. Legal guardian to her younger brother Leo Johnson, 17. Currently enrolled in the nursing program at Columbia University Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. Works 2 jobs to cover tuition and living expenses. The Oak Room, primary, and occasional weekend shifts at a diner in the Bronx. No criminal record, no outstanding debts beyond student loans. Address, a 2-bedroom apartment on Grand Concourse, Bronx. Alexander leaned back in his chair. It wasn't the file of a grifter or an opportunist. It was the file of a fighter, an orphan raising her brother, putting herself through one of the most demanding nursing schools in the country by working herself to the bone. Her refusal of his money was no longer just a point of pride, it was an act of profound sacrifice. He looked at the name of the diner, Mel's Diner. He felt a strange pull, an urge to see her in her own environment, away from the artificial gloss of his world. He made a decision. He would go to this diner, but as he was telling his driver to head for the Bronx, his phone buzzed. It was Harrison. "Sir," Harrison's voice was calm as always, but there was an undercurrent of something else. "There's been a development regarding Kaylee Johnson." "What is it?" Alexander asked. "She was terminated from her position at the Oak Room this morning, effective immediately." Alexander went very still. "On what grounds?" "According to her manager, a Mr. Abernathy, for unprofessional conduct in violation of company policy. The incident report specifically cites her interaction with you and your son yesterday." The line went silent for a moment. The air in the back of the Rolls-Royce grew cold. The quiet awe Alexander had felt was now replaced by a surge of pure, cold fury. She had been punished. Punished for the one moment of genuine human warmth his son had received in years. The injustice of it was galling, but what was worse was his own unwitting role in it. His presence, his power, had inadvertently led to her ruin. "Change of plans," Alexander said to his driver, his voice dangerously quiet. "We're going back to the Sterling Plaza. Now." Then into the phone. "Harrison, get me everything you can on a man named Abernathy. I want to know where he buys his coffee, and get me Kaylee Johnson's home address. I'll be making a personal visit." The transaction was over. This was about to become personal. Alexander Sterling moved through the lobby of his own hotel like a storm front. Staff members, accustomed to his aloof and distant presence, flattened themselves against walls as he strode past, his face a mask of controlled rage. Frank, his security guard, was 2 steps behind him, looking more imposing than ever. He didn't head for the elevators to his penthouse suite. He marched directly towards the Oak Room. It was mid-afternoon, the lull between lunch and dinner service. The restaurant was mostly empty, save for staff polishing glasses and folding napkins. Mr. Abernathy was standing near the reservation desk, preening over the evening's seating chart. He looked up and saw Alexander Sterling bearing down on him, and the color drained from his face. This was highly unusual. Mr. Sterling never came down to the restaurant floor unannounced. "Mr. Sterling, what an unexpected pleasure," Abernathy stammered, attempting a sycophantic smile. Alexander didn't slow his pace until he was inches from the smaller man, forcing Abernathy to crane his neck to look up at him. "Abernathy," Alexander's voice was so low it was almost a whisper, yet it carried more menace than a shout. "I was just made aware of a staffing change you made this morning." Abernathy swallowed hard. "Ah, yes. A minor internal matter, I assure you. Maintaining the highest standards. You fired the waitress? Kaylee Johnson." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. She violated a clear and explicit policy. It was a regrettable but necessary action to maintain the integrity of our—" "The integrity?" Alexander interrupted, his voice dripping with contempt. "Let me tell you about integrity. For a few minutes yesterday, that woman showed my son more compassion and decency than he has felt in a very long time. She treated him like a human being. That is the highest standard of service I can possibly imagine. A standard you clearly wouldn't recognize." Abernathy was trembling now. "Sir, with all due respect, I was protecting the restaurant's reputation." "You were protecting your own pathetic sense of authority," Alexander snarled. "You saw an employee demonstrate a quality you lack, empathy, and you punished her for it. You took an act of kindness and twisted it into an infraction." He leaned in closer, his cold blue eyes boring into Abernathy's. "You are the manager of a restaurant in my building. Your salary is paid by the profits generated under my name, and you used your minuscule portion of that power to harm someone who brought a moment of light into my son's life. Effective immediately, your services are no longer required. Collect your personal effects. Frank will escort you out." Abernathy stared, his mouth agape, utterly defeated. The swift, brutal, poetic justice was absolute. Frank stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Abernathy's shoulder, and began leading the now former manager away, speechless and broken. Alexander turned without a backward glance. The injustice had been rectified, but the source of it remained. He had a promise to keep. An hour later, Alexander's Rolls-Royce Phantom, a sleek black vessel of impossible wealth, looked profoundly out of place parked on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. The building was a pre-war walk-up, its facade showing the dignified wear of generations. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby playground. This was a world away from the hushed corridors of power Alexander inhabited. He took the elevator, which groaned in protest, up to the 5th floor. He found the apartment and knocked. For a moment, there was no answer. Then the door opened a crack, held by a chain lock. A teenage boy with a spray of freckles and wary eyes peered out. He had the same determined set to his jaw as his sister. This had to be Leo. "Can I help you?" Leo asked, his voice suspicious. He'd never seen a man in a suit this expensive outside of movies. "I'm here to see Kaylee Johnson," Alexander said, his tone softer than it had been all day. "My name is Alexander Sterling." Leo's eyes widened in recognition. He closed the door, the chain rattled, and then he opened it fully. She's in her room." The apartment was small but immaculately clean. The walls, as Kaylee had said, were covered in vibrant, stunningly detailed drawings and designs, a testament to Leo's talent. The air smelled of turpentine and cinnamon. On a small dining table sat a stack of textbooks next to a plate with a half-eaten sandwich. It was a home filled with struggle, but also with love and ambition. Kaylee emerged from her room. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but when she saw him, they widened in shock. She was wearing an old paint-splattered sweatshirt and worn-out leggings. She looked young and vulnerable. "Mr. Sterling, what are you doing here?" "I came to apologize," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "I learned what happened at the restaurant. It was my fault. I am truly sorry." Kaylee was speechless. The billionaire titan of industry was standing in her tiny living room, apologizing to her. "And I came to make you an offer," he continued, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the evidence of her difficult life. "A real one. Not the insult I offered you yesterday." He looked her straight in the eye. "I want to hire you. I want you to be Daniel's full-time caregiver. Not just a nurse, but a companion. I saw how you were with him. You connected with him in a way no one else has." He laid out the terms, each one more life-altering than the last. "I will pay you a salary triple what you were making at the Oak Room. I will pay for the remainder of your nursing school tuition in full. I will also cover the cost of this apartment, so you and your brother don't have to worry. Furthermore," he added, glancing at the art on the walls, "I know of a very prestigious summer program for young artists at NYU. I will arrange a full scholarship for Leo, should he be interested." Kaylee stared at him, her mind reeling. It was an impossible offer. It was a fairy tale. It was a solution to every single problem that kept her awake at night. "Why?" she finally whispered. "Why would you do all this?" Alexander's gaze softened, the corporate titan momentarily receding to reveal the weary father. "Because for 5 minutes in my restaurant, you gave my son a gift I couldn't buy him. You gave him normalcy. You gave him a smile. My money can solve a lot of problems, Miss Johnson, but it can't solve that one. But I have a feeling you can." He paused, his voice dropping slightly. "I'm not asking you to save my son. I'm asking you to help him live, and to maybe in the process help me learn how to be a father to him again." Tears streamed down Kaylee's face, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of disbelief, of overwhelming gratitude, and of a sudden, blinding hope. The worst day of her life was turning into the most important. She looked past the billionaire and saw the desperate father. She thought of Daniel and the flicker of light she had seen in his eyes. This wasn't just a job, it was a calling. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I accept." Kaylee's new life began the following Monday. Stepping into the Sterling penthouse was like entering another dimension. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking. Double-height ceilings, windows that framed Central Park like a living masterpiece, and an unnerving, museum-like silence. A housekeeper with a kind but reserved smile showed her to her own suite of rooms, which was larger than her entire Bronx apartment. But the opulence was not what mattered. What mattered was Daniel. She found him in his room, which was filled with state-of-the-art technology, computers with adaptive keyboards, voice command software, and a massive screen. He was staring at a line of code, his face set in the same frustrated mask she remembered from the restaurant. The first few days were challenging. Daniel was wary. He was used to a rotating cast of clinical professionals who treated him like a set of symptoms. He tested Kaylee, sometimes refusing to cooperate with his physical therapy exercises, other times retreating into stony silence. Kaylee, however, was relentlessly patient. She didn't push. She simply existed in his space, a calm and steady presence. She learned his routines not from a chart handed to her by a previous nurse, but by observing him. She saw that the tension in his hands eased when he listened to classical music, so she filled the room with the quiet strains of Chopin. She noticed his eyes lingering on the art books on his shelves, so she sat and read to him about the Impressionists, describing the brushstrokes and the play of light. The breakthrough came a week later. Kaylee was helping him with his physical therapy, a series of painful stretches designed to combat the spasticity in his muscles. He was resisting, his body rigid, a low groan of frustration in his throat. "I know it hurts," Kaylee said softly, easing the pressure. "We can stop if you want." He shook his head vehemently. He wanted to do it, but the frustration was overwhelming. "Okay," Kaylee said, changing tactics. "Let's make a deal. We do this one last stretch, and then you show me what you're working on." She gestured to the computer screen. "For real, not just the finished product. Show me the code. I have no idea what it means, but I want to see your world." Daniel looked at her, surprised. No one had ever asked about his coding. They just saw it as a hobby that kept him occupied. To him, it was his voice, his way of building worlds he could control. He gave a slow nod. They finished the stretch, and he wheeled his chair over to the computer. With painstaking effort, using a specialized trackball mouse, he began to show her his project. It was a simple game, but the logic behind it was complex and elegant. As he pointed to different lines of code, he would make small sounds, his own form of explanation. Kaylee didn't pretend to understand the technical details. Instead, she asked about the story of the game, the character he'd created. "So he's looking for a lost star?" she asked, leaning in. "Why is it lost?" Daniel paused, then typed slowly onto the screen with his adaptive keyboard. BECAUSEITFORGOTHOWTOSHINE. Kaylee's heart ached. She looked from the screen to his face. "And the hero? He's going to help it remember." Daniel nodded, a flicker of a smile on his lips. He wasn't just building a game. He was telling his own story, and she was the first person to bother reading the pages. From that day on, a bridge was built between them. They developed their own language, a mix of spoken words, typed messages, and shared glances. She encouraged his passions, bringing him books on programming and art, and even convincing Leo to come by and show Daniel some of his graphic design work. The two boys from vastly different worlds bonded over their shared creativity. The silent penthouse began to fill with the sound of quiet conversation and occasionally laughter. Alexander observed all of this from a distance. He would come home from his office expecting the usual oppressive silence and would instead hear the faint sound of music or Kaylee's gentle voice reading aloud. He would stand in the doorway of Daniel's room, unseen, and watch as his son, once withdrawn and angry, engaged with Kaylee, his eyes bright with interest. He saw Kaylee not just caring for Daniel's physical needs, but nurturing his spirit. She advocated for him, arguing with a therapist that a new, experimental communication device might be worth a try. She celebrated his victories, no matter how small, a line of code written, a physical exercise completed without pain. One evening, Alexander came home to find them in the living room. Kaylee was helping Daniel with the new communication device, an advanced tablet that tracked his eye movements to select words and phrases. He was slowly, painstakingly forming a sentence. He watched as Daniel's eyes darted across the screen, finally locking on the last word. The device's synthesized voice spoke out, clear and steady. THANKYOUCHLOE. Kaylee beamed, her face glowing with pride. "You're welcome, Daniel. You did all the hard work." Alexander felt a tightening in his chest. It had been years since he'd heard his son form a full sentence. even through a machine. He had provided the technology, the money, but Kaylee had provided the catalyst. She had provided the hope. That night, for the first time, Alexander didn't go straight to his home office after dinner. He sat down in the living room, not as a billionaire or a boss, but simply as a father. He asked Daniel to show him his game, and as his son used his new device to explain the story of the hero searching for a lost star, Alexander finally understood. The star wasn't just a metaphor for Daniel, it was for him too. And Kaylee was the one teaching them both how to shine again. Just as a fragile peace began to settle over the Sterling household, a new threat emerged, not from the outside world, but from within the family itself. Her name was Eleanor Sterling Vance, Alexander's younger sister. Eleanor was a woman sculpted from suspicion and entitlement. She moved through the world with the firm belief that the Sterling name and fortune were hers to protect, primarily for her own benefit. She saw Alexander's grief over his late wife and his detachment from Daniel not as a tragedy, but as a weakness, one she had long tried to manage and manipulate. She arrived at the penthouse unannounced one afternoon, draped in Chanel and dripping with disdain. She found Kaylee and Daniel on the terrace, working on a small herb garden Kaylee had started. Daniel, for the first time, was using his hands to gently pat soil into a pot, a huge milestone in his physical therapy. There was genuine dirt under his fingernails, and he was smiling. Eleanor's lip curled. "Alexander," she said, striding onto the terrace, her voice like cracking ice. "What is the meaning of this? Who is this person? And why is Daniel playing in the mud like a commoner?" Alexander, who had been watching from the doorway with a rare look of pride, turned to face his sister. "Eleanor, this is Kaylee Johnson, Daniel's companion, and Daniel is planting rosemary." Eleanor gave Kaylee a dismissive, head-to-toe glance, her eyes cataloging the simple clothes and the lack of expensive jewelry. Her assessment was swift and brutal. Nobody. "Companion?" Eleanor scoffed. "You fired his entire team of world-class specialists for a waitress?" The word dripped with poison. "I hired Ms. Johnson because she is precisely what Daniel needs," Alexander said, his voice firm. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor became a toxic presence in the penthouse. She treated Kaylee with unconcealed contempt, referring to her as the help or the girl. She would interrupt Kaylee and Daniel's sessions with thinly veiled criticisms, questioning Kaylee's methods and qualifications. "Are you sure that's a therapeutically sound activity?" she'd ask with a saccharine smile as Kaylee and Daniel worked on a puzzle. "My friend on the board of the Neurological Institute says routine is paramount." She tried to sow seeds of doubt in Alexander's mind. "Don't you find it all a bit convenient, Alex?" she'd murmur to him over dinner. "This girl from the Bronx, suddenly a fixture in your life. The salary, the scholarships. It's the oldest story in the book. You have to be careful of these people. They see you as a walking wallet." But Alexander's faith in Kaylee was unwavering. He saw the tangible results of her presence every day. He saw his son's vocabulary on the communication device expand, his physical coordination improve, and most importantly, his spirit heal. Daniel, who had always been withdrawn and sullen around his aunt, now met her intrusions with a quiet defiance, often turning his attention pointedly back to Kaylee. This only enraged Eleanor further. She saw Kaylee not just as a gold digger, but as a rival for influence over her brother, and by extension, the family fortune. She saw the bond between Kaylee and Daniel, and the thawing relationship between Daniel and Alexander, as a threat to the status quo she had so carefully maintained. Her campaign escalated from passive aggression to active sabotage. One afternoon, a valuable Fabergé egg, a cherished memento of Alexander's late wife, went missing from its display case in the library. Eleanor immediately launched into a hysterical performance. "It's gone! The one piece of his mother's he truly loved!" she cried, directing her suspicious glare towards Kaylee. "It wasn't gone this morning. It's only been the staff in here. And her." Kaylee was horrified. "I would never," she stammered. "I haven't even been in the library today." "Of course you'd say that," Eleanor shot back. "Alexander, you must call the police. You must have her things searched." Alexander looked at his sister's theatrical display, then at Kaylee's pale, shocked face. He saw Daniel in his wheelchair, furiously typing a message on his device. He walked over to his son. The synthesized voice filled the tense silence. A UNTELENORBEFORENEBEFOOKEDNERVOUS. Alexander's eyes hardened. He looked at his sister, whose face had gone rigid. Is that true, Eleanor? Were you in here alone? I I was just admiring it, she sputtered. Without another word, Alexander walked over to the large potted fern in the corner of the room. He reached deep into the soil. His fingers closed around something hard and smooth. He pulled out the Fabergé egg covered in dirt. The silence was deafening. Eleanor's plot was laid bare, clumsy and cruel. She had been willing to frame Kaylee, to destroy her reputation and her life, all to reclaim her own perceived position of power. Alexander held up the dirt-covered egg. His voice was devoid of all emotion, a terrifying calm. You would use our mother's memory for a pathetic game like this? You would try to destroy an innocent woman who has done nothing but bring joy and healing into this house? Alexander, I was just trying to protect you, she pleaded, her composure crumbling. Protect me? He laughed, a short, bitter sound. You weren't protecting me. You were protecting your own access, your own influence. I see that now. He walked towards her. For years, you've encouraged my distance from Daniel. You fed my worst instincts because a broken family was easier for you to navigate. But this family is healing now, and there's no place in it for your poison. He pointed toward the door. Get out, Eleanor. Get out of my home, and do not come back until you are ready to apologize not to me, but to Kaylee and to my son. Defeated and exposed, Eleanor Sterling Vance fled, leaving a wake of shattered trust behind her. In that moment, Alexander hadn't just defended his employee. He had defended his family. He had chosen the quiet caregiver from the Bronx over his own sister. He had chosen kindness over blood. And in doing so, he cemented the foundation of the new life they were all building together. The confrontation with Eleanor was a turning point. It had purged the last vestiges of toxicity from the penthouse. But more importantly, it had solidified the bond between the three of them into something unbreakable. Alexander, having defended Kaylee so fiercely, no longer saw her as just an employee. He saw her as an essential part of their family's recovery. He finally shed the last layers of his armor. He started coming home earlier. He canceled evening meetings to be present for dinner. He stopped observing from the doorway and started participating. He learned to operate the communication device so he could speak with Daniel directly. He sat with them during therapy sessions, offering encouragement not as a benefactor, but as a father. One Saturday afternoon, Kaylee had an idea. The weather was perfect, a warm autumn day. Let's go to the park, she suggested. Not just the terrace, the real park. It was a logistical challenge. Daniel hadn't been to Central Park for a simple stroll in years. Trips were usually for medical appointments, involving a team and a specialized vehicle. It was an ordeal. We can do it, Kaylee insisted, looking at Alexander. Just the three of us. Alexander, the man who commanded a global empire, found himself taking orders from the 24-year-old nurse. They packed a simple picnic. They navigated Daniel's high-tech wheelchair out of the building and into the bustling city streets. For Alexander, it was a revelation. He was used to being sealed inside his Rolls-Royce, observing the world through tinted glass. Now he was in it. He felt the sun on his face, heard the cacophony of the city, and felt the small, profound thrill of simply walking beside his son. They found a quiet spot by the lake. As Kaylee laid out the blanket, Alexander knelt beside Daniel's chair. It's beautiful out here, isn't it, son? He said, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel, using his device, typed a response. IMISSEDTHESUN. The simple sentence struck Alexander like a physical blow. In his quest to provide his son with every material comfort, every medical advantage, he had forgotten the simple things, the sun, the fresh air, the feeling of being part of the world. He looked at Daniel, truly looked at him, not as a collection of disabilities or a source of his own pain, but as his child, his brilliant, resilient, beautiful boy. The years of emotional distance, of shame and anger and grief for the wife he'd lost, and the perfect son he'd never had, finally crumbled away, leaving only a vast, aching regret. "Daniel," Alexander began, his voice cracking. I, I am so sorry." Tears streamed freely down the billionaire's face. There was no one here to see him, no one to judge, just his son and the woman who had made this moment possible. "I'm sorry for all the years I was absent," he choked out. "I was so lost after your mother died. I buried myself in work and I let you down. I was a terrible father. I saw your challenges and I didn't see you. I am so, so sorry." Daniel watched his father, his own eyes welling with tears. He had waited his entire life to hear these words. He had yearned for this connection, for this admission. He painstakingly typed a message, his fingers flying across the screen with newfound urgency. "I-K-N-O-W-D-A-D-I-F-O-R-G-I-V-E-Y-O-U." Alexander read the words and let out a sob, a raw, wrenching sound of 16 years of pent-up grief and love. He leaned forward and wrapped his arms around his son's shoulders, hugging him properly for the first time in memory. Daniel, with a strength Alexander didn't know he possessed, lifted his right arm and patted his father's back, a gesture of comfort, of forgiveness, of a son finally able to comfort his father. Kaylee watched from a short distance away, her own tears flowing freely. This was the real payment for her kindness. Not the salary, not the tuition, but this. Witnessing this sacred moment of healing, of a father and son finding their way back to each other across a chasm of pain. She had been the bridge. The lost star hadn't just been found. It was burning brighter than ever, and its warmth was finally being felt. The change that began in the heart of the Oak Room didn't just alter one life. It rippled outwards, transforming everyone it touched. 2 years later, Kaylee Johnson walked across the stage at Columbia University's graduation ceremony, not just with a nursing degree, but as the class valedictorian. In the audience, Leo, now a thriving student at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts on a full Sterling scholarship, cheered wildly. Beside him, Daniel sat in his wheelchair, his smile wide and proud. And next to Daniel sat Alexander Sterling, his applause the loudest in the auditorium, his eyes filled with a warmth that had long been absent. But Kaylee's journey didn't end with a degree. On the day of her graduation, Alexander presented her with a new proposal. He had established a new charitable organization, the Lily Sterling Foundation, named after his late wife. Its mission was twofold: to fund cutting-edge research and provide resources for children with cerebral palsy, and to create support networks and grant programs for the families and caregivers who love them. He didn't want any other family to feel the isolation and despair that his had, and he asked Kaylee to be its first executive director. "I build companies, Kaylee," he had told her, "but you build people. You have the vision and the heart to make this mean something." Kaylee accepted, her life's calling now given a platform she could never have imagined. Under her leadership, the Lily Sterling Foundation became a beacon of hope for thousands. It funded the development of new communication technologies, like the one Daniel now used with effortless skill. It created community centers where children could receive therapy and parents could find support. Kaylee, the waitress from the Bronx, was now a celebrated advocate, changing lives on a scale that mirrored the size of the fortune that funded it. Leo flourished, becoming a sought-after young talent in the world of digital animation, his first professional project being a series of animated shorts for the Foundation's website. Daniel, with Kaylee's constant encouragement and his father's unwavering support, thrived. He not only finished his game, but licensed it to an educational software company. He became a public speaker, using his device to advocate for disability rights, his intelligence and wit charming audiences everywhere. He was no longer a prisoner in his body, he was a pioneer, showing the world what was possible, and Alexander Sterling was a changed man. The granite had softened, the armor was gone. He sold off a portion of his empire to focus on the foundation, working alongside Kaylee and his son. He learned that his greatest legacy wouldn't be the buildings that bore his name, but the lives that were changed by his family story. He found the happiness that had eluded him for so long, not in the acquisition of things, but in the act of giving. Sometimes on quiet afternoons, the three of them would go back to that spot in Central Park. They would sit by the lake, a strange and beautiful family forged in a moment of unexpected kindness in a fancy restaurant. A father who learned to see, a son who found his voice, and a woman who, by offering a hand to a struggling boy, had inadvertently reminded an entire world of wealth what it truly meant to be rich. She hadn't just gotten her life changed, she had been the catalyst that changed everything. In the end, this wasn't a story about money changing a life. It was a story about how humanity is the one currency that truly matters. Kaylee's single act of kindness wasn't an investment for a future reward. It was an expression of her character. It reminds us that the most powerful thing we can ever offer another person is not what we have in our wallets, but what we have in our hearts: dignity, respect, and compassion. Alexander Sterling had everything, but it took a waitress with nothing to show him what was truly valuable. Their story proves that one small moment, one person choosing connection over indifference, can set in motion a tidal wave of healing and hope that can redefine forever. If this story touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. What did Kaylee's act of courage mean to you? And don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and remind us of the incredible power of the human spirit. Thank you for watching.